horizontal velocity divided by the time we need to reach this velocity. Additionally, I think you all remember Newton's second law, which describes the rate of change of a momentum is always proportional to the force applied. That means acceleration also equals force divided by mass. If you're a sprinter or jumper, the mass describes your body weight. And that already indicates one of the major changes we've seen within the last maybe 8-10 years in the world of athletics. Previously, the 100-meter sprinters were very bulky, very powerful. They did a lot of hypertrophy, so extremely strong men or women, but at the same time, they had a relatively high body weight. And as you can see in this equation, if you increase the strength, let's say by 10%, but because of a lot of hypertrophy training, the body mass at the same time is also increasing by 10%, the acceleration eventually will not be affected. So we always have to ensure that if we are conducting strength training, which is necessary to improve our acceleration, that the force, our body strength, is increasing more significantly than the body mass is doing. Yeah, so we need to become stronger, we need to develop stronger athletes, but we have to ensure that these athletes are, if possible, able to maintain their body weight. So nowadays, if you see the finals or semi-finals at World Championships, at Olympic Games, we actually observe that the sprinters are not that bulky any longer. They are relatively skinny in comparison to the sprinters or even jumpers 10 or 15 years ago. So in your training, when you're affecting the strength, consider or reconsider this idea of doing a lot of hypertrophy and try to maintain your body mass as good as possible. When we are taking the equation of these two acceleration formulas, horizontal velocity divided by time, and at the other time, force divided by mass, we realize that horizontal velocity means force multiplied by time divided by mass. And most of you will realize that force multiplied by time equals the impulse. And impulse simply means how much force are we able to generate within a certain amount of time. And this impulse or momentum becomes one of the critical factors for all athletics events, because we need to ensure that we're developing a lot of strengths, but as you know, we only have a limited time. Faster sprinters always have shorter ground contact times. Better long jumpers also have shorter contact times. Better shot throwers are able to accelerate the shot in a faster way with lesser time. And this is called the impulse. And we have to, you will see an example later, we have to ensure that we're able to increase the impulse, force over time. And that means we need to develop very explosive athletes who are able to reach a high so-called rate of force development. And we need to ensure that our athletes are able to generate as much force as possible within as little time as possible. And due to technical reasons, they have to apply it in an optimal direction. So overall, as a rule of thumb, we have to increase our strengths. As seen here, force means strength. We have to increase that. We have to reduce the time because we know faster sprinters, better jumpers, they show shorter ground contact times. And we have to ensure that the force will be applied in a horizontal way. And that, of course, depends on your running technique. And we know that faster sprinters or sprinters who show better acceleration usually have a larger incline angle. That means more forward lean. It does not mean that if you're dealing with young athletes, inexperienced athletes, for example, that they have to maintain this massive forward lean. Because especially young athletes, in many cases, are not strong enough. Their back extensors, their glutes are not yet strong enough to ensure a proper forward lean. So we can see that force or strength and technique are directly related to each other. But faster sprinters usually show a greater forward lean. This greater forward lean, to maintain this position, requires more strength, especially of your hip extensors. When we're talking about sprinting technique, and again, technique simply means the way how you apply your strength to the ground. We have 6 main foci. One foci is the so-called body position. that we need to ensure a vertical alignment of the body, as we can see here. Yeah, you can see the head is in a direct elongation of the upper body, and we only have a very small forward lean, usually say around 1 or 2 degrees. We need a neutral pelvis position, and Coach Raj Mohan and Nagesh, they will elaborate on this a bit more tomorrow morning. But we can already see here, we have a very neutral pelvis position for all the sprinters, no so-called anterior or posterior tilt, because that would disable our sprinters from having an optimal stride rate. Additionally, the second FOCI is the so-called arm action. And you can see Shelley and Fraser Price here with a perfect backward orientated movement. If you imagine yourself sitting in a wheelchair, moving with your arms forward, the wheelchair eventually would move backwards. If you're sitting in your wheelchair and you move both arms rapidly backwards, the wheelchair is going to move forward, because every movement depends on the so-called reaction force. Yeah, it's another law of Newton that every force is facing another force working in the entirely different direction. So we have to use this counterforce to propel our body forward, and that's the reason why every arm action has to be focusing on the backward movement. And we need to hammer our hands backwards, our arms backwards. With the elbow only slightly bended, there's actually relatively elbow movement during the running. And once the lower part of your hand reaches an orthogonal position, yeah, vertical to the ground, that's where we have to block the arm movement. You can see it here or here with a second sprinter and even with this sprinter. Yeah, so actively hammer your arms backwards and block them once the lower arm is in a 90-degree angle to the ground. In addition to the body position and the arm action, we have 4 additional FOCI regarding the stride cycle. We have 4 phases. The first one is the so-called ground preparation. Yeah, it starts when we actually lowering our knee, hammering down, how some coaches say. Then we have the ground contact, when the foot touches the ground. When the foot is leaving the ground during the takeoff, we start our recovery phase. And then we have a transition phase from the so-called hip flexion to the hip extension. Yeah, I can give you another example. You see the following video here of Judy Chand during the interstate championships. Now the recovery phase begins. You see the transition, ground contact, and the transition phase of the right leg. Another ground contact. Yeah, so each stride cycle consists of a ground preparation when the leg is moving downwards. I will start it again. Yeah, we have the ground contact phase here, and we have to keep that as short as possible, followed by the so-called recovery phase. When the knee starts to move forward, we're looking at the right leg here. Once the knee reaches the forward position, and that's always in coincidence with the takeoff of the opposite foot, we start the ground preparation, another ground contact. Yeah, recovery phase, transition phase, and one last time, ground contact, initiation of the recovery phase, now we reach the transition phase, and immediately after the transition phase, we start our ground preparation. Yeah, and just have a close look again. The transition phase just describes the transition from the hip flexion to the hip extension. So please keep these 4 phases of a stride cycle in mind when we are discussing the technical aspects of high-speed running later today and tomorrow. When we're talking about the 100 meter, we always have to consider a so-called race plan. Each race in the sprints consists of different phases. We have the start phase, the initial acceleration, the transition phase, maximum velocity, and speed maintenance. In this chart here, you can see a biomechanical analysis of Usain Bolt's world record of 9.58 seconds during his world record race in Berlin 2009. Here you can see that we have the start, and usually the first and second step are considered to be parts of the start phase because the action on these first two steps highly depends on what happens in the start block. This is immediately followed by initial acceleration phase, sometimes also called pure acceleration, which you can see here. Afterwards, we have the transition phase, which some coaches call the pick-up acceleration. We call it transition because it's a transition actually from the pure acceleration, where we have an almost linear incline angle of the acceleration curve. And then it gets a bit more asymptotical towards the maximum velocity phase. And the maximum velocity phase is when the sprinter reaches 99% of the maximum running velocity. And it ends when sprinters are leaving this 99% zone. And afterwards, at the end, we have the speed maintenance or speed endurance phase, where most sprinters actually start decelerating. Yeah, so we have the start, the initial acceleration or pure acceleration, transition phase, sometimes called pick-up acceleration. We have the maximum velocity phase and the speed maintenance. Interestingly, Usain Bolt reached the maximum velocity at approximately 63, 64 meters during his world record. But you can see that the maximum velocity phase for him started at around 48 meters. So from 48 to 63 meters, within 15 meters, he was only able to improve his maximum velocity by additional 1%. And that's why we usually call this phase as a maximum velocity phase, as a phase of stable speed. Here we have an overview about the most or the fastest women in the world. Yeah, we see the 100 meter times 10.73 to 10.9. And we have a comparison with some of the fastest girls in India in 2019. And what you can see here, the 100 meter time, as well as the 60 meter time, which has been measured using scientific methods, some light gaze or video analysis. And you can directly observe that athletes who want to do or who want to run a very fast 100 meter time also have a very good 60 meter time. Here in the next column, you can see the interval from 60 to 100 meter, and in the last column, the percentage. How much is the difference or the relationship between the distance from 60 to 100 meter to the overall 100 meter time? And for world-class athletes, that's usually around 35.5 to 35.8%. That means the part from 60 to 100 meter accounts for approximately 35% of the overall 100 meter time. If you compare this with the Indian athletes, you see that the values are usually between 36 up to 37, almost 38%. And we have to ask ourselves the question, how does this happen? What is the reason why our athletes, our local athletes, on the second part of the race from 60 to 100 meter are so much slower in comparison to world-class athletes? Of course, we can see that they're not as fast yet on the 60 meters, which means there might be a higher accumulation of lactic acid, which causes a larger negative acceleration at the end of the race. Yeah, therefore the 100 meter time becomes a bit slower as well. But we have to ask, why does this happen? Because we know that a lot of our Indian athletes are actually doing or using several speed endurance sessions throughout the weeks. We mentioned this earlier already. It's very common in India to have high amount of lactic acids during your training week, often throughout the year. Yeah, we know a lot of coaches who are applying 2-3 speed endurance sessions in a microcycle. Still, we can see that obviously this last part of the race is a weakness when it comes to Indian athletes in comparison to their international counterparts. If we do a race analysis and if you compare this here, just the average of the top 10 international athletes to the top 10 Indian athletes, we can see the Indians are almost for around 4/10 of a second slower when it comes to 60 meters, but almost 8/10 of a second slower when it comes to the 100-meter time. And we can see a huge difference here at this percentage of the 60 to 100-meter interval in comparison to the 100-meter time. 35.6 in comparison to 36.5%. And this is a very clear indicator that our Indian athletes show a lack of speed regarding the 60-meter times. And it's not only in the 100-meter, we can see that in the 400-meter, even in the throws, it's mid to long distance events. But our sprinters even show a greater lack of speed endurance. And that leads us to the conclusion that we have to adjust our idea of speed training. We have to focus on the development of pure speed, and we probably have to step back from applying a lot of lactic speed endurance training, because it obviously does not work in the way we would like it to work. So considering the physiology, and there's one of the major changes which also happened in the recent years, to affect pure speed, our athletes have to avoid producing lactic acid, because lactic acid always leads to deceleration. Your stride frequency will go down, and that has a direct impact on your horizontal running velocity. We know that adenosine triphosphate and creatine phosphate are covering the first 6 seconds of an energy production. And this is one of the changes in sport science. Previously, a lot of scientists mentioned that the ATP-CP system are accountable for the first 9 to 10 seconds of a race. But sport scientists have figured out that this is actually not the case, because even a world-class 100-meter sprinter is producing almost 10 to 12 millimole of lactic acid. Yeah, if ATP-CP were covering the full 100-meter, there would only be very, very, very little lactic acid. But we've realized, or sport scientists have realized, that this is not the case. And that's why nowadays we say ATP-CP are not covering more than 6 seconds of energy production. And this is pretty much in line with the race analysis I've shown previously. Male athletes always reach their maximum velocity, the peak velocity, at around 6 to 6.2 seconds. Female athletes usually between 6.2 and 6.4 seconds. And interestingly, that's the same across all age groups, whether you're 15 years old or 25 or 35. Yeah, an athlete is usually peaking after 6 to 6.4 seconds. The male athlete is a bit earlier, the female athletes a bit later. And that means for us that we have to keep our pure speed work shorter than 6 to 7 seconds, because every load which is longer than 6 to 7 seconds will accumulate the amount of lactic acid, and that will directly cause a deceleration. And that's one of the reasons why AFI decided, I've introduced this idea earlier already, that AFI decided to shorten some of the race distances for our young athletes, that instead of running 100 meters, they have to only cover 60 meters or 80 meters to reduce the necessary time and to focus more on the development of this pure speed. Another implication based on these seconds of ATP and CP production is that we should plan our training according to duration rather than distance. It does not necessarily make sense to tell your training group that today we're doing 60 meters times 3, especially if you have different genders or different age groups in your training group. Because if you have a 12-year-old girl and you ask her to run 60 meters, it might easily take her 8-9 seconds, maybe even longer. And 9 seconds, that means 50% or 33% of the time she's decelerating already. If you have a 25-year-old male top sprinter, within 7 seconds, he's able to cover the full 60 meter. That means he's not producing lactic acid at all. So we have to consider the energy systems by developing our training programs. Yeah, and ensure if you have a speed session, that your session or your single repetitions don't last for more than 6 to 7 seconds, because otherwise your athletes will produce lactic acid and you're focusing more on speed endurance rather than endurance. And as we've learned already, especially with the young athletes, we have to avoid the accumulation of lactic acid because this will significantly extend the necessary recovery times, which will have an impact on the quality of your daily training sessions. So to summarize it, speed training, and speed training usually includes acceleration and or speed training. We've already discussed that we need a very high intensity. That means at least 98 or 99% of your maximum running velocity to have an impact on the central nervous system. Yeah, again, as a rule of thumb, whenever we want to affect the central nervous system, we need a high intensity, a high quality of our movement. And for acceleration work, that means usually we're spending between 1 or 4 and 5 seconds. For speed work, 1 to 6 or 7 seconds. And since the central nervous system is affected, we need a very long rest. And that might be another change you have to include in your training. For 1 second of load during the acceleration, we should give 1 or 2 minutes of recovery. Let's say you ask your athlete to conduct a 30-meter start, which takes approximately 4 seconds. So you have to give them 4, maybe if it's a very intensive session, up to 8 minutes, even after a 30-meter start. If you're conducting a 30-meter flying session with a senior athlete, and let's say it takes them approximately 2.8 seconds. But we know for 30-meter flying, you need another 40 meters of acceleration. So the overall load is approximately 6.5, 7 seconds. It's the same. Yeah, we need 90 seconds up to 2 minutes per second of rest. That means if you're running 7 seconds on your 30-meter flying, you can give your athlete up to 14 minutes of recovery. And this is required, not necessarily for the ATP-C3 system to be refilled, but for the central nervous system to recover. Yeah, and whenever you see that the quality of your training session is not, or the athletes are not able to maintain the quality of the session, that the intensity is dropping, going below 98%, you have to either increase the rest length or you have to stop your session. Yeah, within this 4 to 5 seconds of acceleration, you're usually able to cover between 10 and 40 meters. Within the speed work, usually between 50 and 70 meters. Again, this is according to the performance level and of course the age of your athlete. Another important aspect is the overall volume. Yeah, for acceleration, we should stick to an overall volume within one session of around 100 to 250 meters. For a speed session, 100 to 300 meters. And I've given you 2 examples below for acceleration, doing, for example, 3 times 20 meters, followed by 2 times 30 meters, and 1 times 40 meters. Yeah, we have 2 minutes of rest in between these different intervals. Here, after the 30 meter, we give 4 minutes of rest. And in between the sets, we have again 4 to 6 minutes. Yeah, as you can see, for the shorter distances, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, and 4 to 6 minutes in between the sets. A typical session to improve your speed might be 4 times 30 meter flying, with a rest time of 12 minutes in between. And since we want to increase the speed, we have to again affect the central nervous system. We need a full approach to reach a high intensity, because remember, it takes approximately 6 seconds to reach this high speed. And to make it a bit easier for our athletes, we can use tailwind to increase the intensity. But you see the overall number of repetitions, 4 times 30 flying, 4 times 30 meter, is relatively low. It's only 4 sets. And the reason is we want to avoid an accumulated fatigue. We have to ensure that while we are affecting speed or acceleration, that our athletes are fully recovered. And that's the main reason why a lot of coaches are conducting the first speed session on a Monday, for example, because usually the Sunday is a rest day and we're able to ensure that our athletes are physically and mentally 100% recovered when they're coming back from the weekend. Yeah, so keep the intensity high, keep the quality high, keep the quality up, and ensure you have enough recovery. If you see that your athletes are getting fatigued, mainly when the intensity is dropping after a few sets, increase the rest or stop the session. Here's this chart. shows, similar to the one I've presented earlier already, the development of a typical 100-meter sprinter in Asia, that's the blue line, and in the world, that's the orange line. Yeah, and we have the different years from 15 to 27. And we see that the Asian athletes show a much earlier stagnation in comparison to world-class sprinters. World-class sprinters are able to improve by more than 1/10 in the per season in the early years, until the age of approximately 20, 21. Asian athletes are far below this 1/10 of a second, often only like 5-6 hundredths of a second. And that is the main difference between talented athletes and very talented athletes. The most gifted athletes are usually able to improve their performance significantly from one season to another. The same applies to the men. Here the situation is even worse. We see that in the age of 15 or 16, the top athletes from Asia are even faster than the average top athlete in the world. But again, they show an early stagnation, and that's at the age of 17, 18, when the world-class athletes are taking over. Yeah? Remember this athletes development session we've had? Often in the beginning, the prematured athletes are showing very good results, very good performances, but later on, they're not able to succeed any longer. At the other hand, these athletes who were physically a bit retarded at the beginning, yeah, who were probably very late bloomers, they show usually a better running technique. And when the puberty comes to an end at the age of 18, 19, these athletes are usually overtaking their competitors who've been beating them at an earlier age. Yeah. Again, remember that performances before the age of 17 or 18 in athletics are not a very good indicator of your athlete's talent. And this is in line with scientific findings as well. Sprinters who perform or do very well at a high junior level without excessive specialization are at the optimal point of departure for senior success. That means athletes who are performing well without having or without showing an early specialization have a much higher chance to succeed. And you don't need to train a lot. It's not necessary to have 10 training sessions for 16 or 17-year-old sprinters already. Yeah, it's relatively easy to be successful if you're training that much. But the real talents, they are able to succeed by having much lesser sessions. They don't need that much training, especially not that much specialized training to succeed. Instead, with these highly talented, highly gifted athletes, you have to conduct a lot of general content, a lot of fundamental abilities, skill training, and you have to implement other sports as well. And the very best athletes usually display greater improvement in the years just preceding the age of peak performance compared with the lower performing counterparts. And if I go back, you see a sprinter here is usually peaking around the age of 25 to 26. And these athletes who are still able to improve in the years preceding this peak age are doing much better in comparison to these athletes who are just able to improve their performance at the beginning of the season. Okay, I will quickly stop and reshare my presentation so that we get rid of all the creative paintings. So the development of pure speed becomes crucial at younger ages. Yeah, from the age 7 to 10, it's important to use a lot of non-linear, or we call it change of direction speed training, where we do a lot of cutting movements, lateral movements, side movements, as you can find them in team sports, to improve the reaction, to improve the kinestetical feedback of the athletes. Once the puberty starts, usually in the age 11 to 14, we are combining this change of direction, non-linear speed training with linear sprints. But again, we're sticking to this 6 or 7 second rule. And at a later part, the non-linear change of direction speed training is not that important for our athletes who are slowly entering the event group specialization. And that means they're conducting more, focusing mainly on linear speed training, again, up to a maximum duration of 7 seconds. But if you have a chance in your districts, in your states, conduct regular speed training sessions and expose your athletes to a lot of different movements. Developing speed does not just mean you have to run from point A to point B. Use ball games, use reaction drills to enhance the speed ability of your athletes. In this overview, you can find a comparison of the female finalist to the male finalist of the World Championships in London 2017. And you see here the average velocity for each 10-meter interval. Yeah, for the first 10 meters, from 20, 20 to 30, and so on, until the end, 90 to 100 meters. You can see the differences between the genders, but we will neglect this today. Interestingly, what you can observe is that female athletes reach the maximum velocity around 50 to 60 meters. And that's the same for the male finalist. But very surprisingly, the female finalists already reach 99% of the maximum velocity. That means this maximum velocity phase at the 40 to 50 meter stage. And they're able to maintain it for usually around 30 to 40 meters. The male finalists, they only reach this maximum velocity phase, 99%, between the period of 50 to 60 meters, and they're not able to maintain it for that long. So usually, female athletes are able to maintain the maximum velocity a bit longer than the male athletes, but at the same time, they're reaching this maximum velocity a bit earlier. The male finalists, they have to reach a peak velocity around 55, 60 meters, but they're not able to maintain it for such a long time. So this maintenance, the maximum velocity phase, is actually much shorter than we usually think it is. And after, remember this overview of the race plan, after the maximum velocity phase, we're directly experiencing a phase of deceleration. And deceleration is mainly due to a reduced stride frequency. Since most of the female sprinters are showing a slightly higher frequency in comparison to male athletes, yeah, they often show a higher deceleration at the end of the race in comparison to the male athletes. So the question we have to ask ourselves now, how do we generate this maximum velocity? Yeah, we've seen there are obviously slight differences. So do we focus on step length development, or do we focus on a development of step frequency? And as the picture already indicates, it's mainly the step frequency we have to improve. Yeah, here's another overview of the same race. And you can see that women, on average, have a much shorter step length in comparison to male athletes. So women showed 2.17 steps, 2.17 meter long steps. The average step length for male athletes is 2 meter 42. The frequency, at the other hand, is very much the same. This was a bit different 10 to 15 years ago, but these days you can find a lot of male sprinters who are using a high step frequency according to the change in training. We know the Chinese sprinter, Zhu Bingtian, for example, sometimes has a step frequency of almost 5 steps per second. Christian Coleman is similar, is a very, very high step rate. The velocity of the female sprinters is just a bit reduced because of the step lengths. And Galina on Saturday already mentioned that the velocity in a cyclic sprint is always a product of step lengths multiplied by step frequency. And the only reason for the reduced velocity of the female athletes is the reduced step lengths. The reduced step lengths, and in comparison, the reduced step length is due to anatomical reasons, because they usually have shorter legs and they have a lower amount of so-called relative strength. Relative strength just means the maximum strength of the hip extensors in comparison to their body weight. Yeah, so reduced leg lengths and a lower relative strength are the reason for the reduced step length, and the reduced step length is the reason for a lower overall horizontal velocity. Because as you can see, the contact times as well as the flight times for male and female athletes are almost the same. Female sprinters therefore do approximately 50 steps in a 100-meter race, and the average male athlete around 45.6 steps. Interestingly, if you relate the step lengths to the body height, you will find that it is about the same for men and women, and it has a factor 1.22. If you divide the average step length of your athlete, the maximum step length, let's say you have a 1 meter 90 tall athlete, his step length would be around 2 meter 50. If you divide 2 meter 50 by 1 meter 90, the ratio should be around 1.22. So if you have a chance to measure the step lengths of your athletes during maximum velocity sprinting, you should be very close to this ratio of 1.22. If you see that it's much lower, let's say 1.15, you know that your athlete definitely has to work more on the frequency. If it's around 1.25, you know, okay, obviously the step length is, if it's 1.25, you see obviously the step length is too long in comparison. You have to work more on the frequency. If you see the step length is below 1.2, around 1.15, you know you have to work on the step length, and that mainly works by increasing your strength. Yeah, as a rule of thumb, the step length of your athlete divided by body height should be around 1.22. If it's longer, you have to focus more on the frequency. If it's shorter, you have to focus more on the power or force application, the technique of your athletes. Still, we haven't answered the question, what is more important, step length or frequency? And here you can find an overview of the finalists again at the championships, World Championships in London 2017. And this data has been compiled by PJ Vazel, a French coach. And you will find the two different ages. Here for Tori Bowie, for example, in the age of 21 and 25. We can always find how fast did she run in the age of 21 and what is her personal best now at the age of 25. And what PJ Vazel was doing, he compared the step lengths and the step frequency at an early stage, an early age of the athlete, and when they were running the personal best. And interesting, you can see that the step length for all the athletes is more or less the same. But when it comes to the step frequency on the right side, you can see that the step frequency is much higher when these athletes were running a personal best in comparison to their early career. And that's the same for the women as it is for the men. Justin Gatlin, for example, when he was 19, he was running 10.08. His personal best is 9.74. So with 19, his step length was 2 meters 35. And due to a change of his technique, Justin Gatlin was overstriding, he reduced his step length, but he massively increased his frequency. Yeah, so we can say in general that the frequency or an improved frequency explains the enhanced performance of a sprinter throughout their career. If you're comparing your athlete in the age of 18 and your athlete in the age of 24 or 25, they should definitely show a higher stride frequency at a later stage. And interestingly, if you compare, for example, the heat to a semi-final or semi-final to a final, that's where we can see an increased step length. Yeah, so changes in power or force application during the step length might occur on a short-term base, maybe due to a higher level of adrenaline, of testosterone. It might be that your athletes are able to apply more force in a final rather than a semi-final. And that explains the increased step length. So, as a rule of thumb, again, we have to focus on step frequency, step rate development, especially with the young athletes, because the frequency seems to be the limiting factor when it comes to the overall performance. So how do we do that? How do we focus on step rate or frequency? And we have a few mechanisms to do so. First of all, we have to reduce the ground contact times and the so-called braking impulses. Yeah, you have seen that the average male athlete is doing 45 steps on the 100 meters. The average female athlete is doing 50 athletes. Let's stick to the female athletes here. If you as a coach are able to decrease the ground contact times of a female athlete only by 0.002 of a second, yeah, 0.002 of each ground contact, which is nothing. But if you multiply it with 50, we're talking of an improvement of 1/10 of a second, which is a massive improvement. Yeah, just by improving the quality of every single ground contact, just by 0.002 of a second, we're able to increase the performance of our 100-meter sprinter by 1/10 of a second. Additionally, we have to increase the velocity of our hip extension. How fast are we able to hammer our legs down? How fast are we able to extend the hip? And that's one of the major technical changes I think we have to introduce to the Indian athletes, because in India we can still find a lot of coaches who are focusing on the so-called high knee exercise, for example. So they are focusing on a knee lift rather than hip extension. But you can only apply force at the ground contact. Yeah, the ground contact is the most important phase for us, because that's where we are able to apply our muscle strength, our force to the ground. And this is eventually causing the propulsion, our body moving forward. So each phase in the sprints is always depending on the preceding phase. Yeah, the quality of the ground contact phase highly depends on our sprinter's action during the ground preparation phase. And remember the 4 cycles of a stride cycle. Yeah, we have the ground contact, the recovery, the transition, and the ground preparation. So the ground contact phase highly depends on the quality of our ground preparation. And ground preparation is nothing else than extending our hip very forcefully and very fast. During the ground contact, we have to avoid amortization. Amortization means bending of the knee. And last but not least, we have to adjust the flight phases. You might have heard that sprinters nowadays focus on the front side mechanics. That means exactly on the ground preparation phase. And we have to optimize the recovery phase. We want to avoid a massive butt kicking, for example. So when we want to focus on frequency, we need to reduce the ground contact times and braking impulses. We need to increase the hip extension velocity. We need to avoid amortization, and we have to improve our technique. And faster sprinters show shorter ground contact times, faster hip extension, and lesser amortization. So that's pretty much in line with the scientific insights. Now it's getting a bit technically. With every ground contact, yeah, we have a so-called braking impulse, because the initial foot plant always happens in front of the body center of mass. Yeah, and as long as the foot placement is in front of the body center of mass, we are braking. We're actually losing energy and reducing our velocity. And only if the body center of mass is crossing the foot placement, yeah, we start accelerating. So at the beginning of each ground contact, we are braking and we're losing velocity. And only when the vertical projection of the body center of mass is crossing the foot placement, we start accelerating. Yeah, here you can see Duty Chant again running. You see the foot is far ahead of her body center of mass. If you draw a vertical line here, you see there's a huge distance, and this distance is called touchdown distance. So as long as this distance is occurring, she will brake, she will lose velocity. That means with every ground contact in the beginning, we are losing speed. And only at mid stance, when the vertical projection of the body center of mass is directly on top or in line with the foot placement on the ground, yeah, that's when we start accelerating. And of course, this acceleration ends when the foot is leaving the ground. So we need to reduce this braking to improve our acceleration. And again, we know that faster sprinters show a more inclined acceleration, and they should also show a longer acceleration. And the main reason for that is because faster sprinters are able to reduce this touchdown distance. So faster sprinters show less deceleration, a smaller braking impulse at the initial stance phase. They are able to get their hip quicker over the foot in comparison to slower sprinters. And here we see another example of Johan Blake, who is considered to have one of the best running techniques we've ever seen in the history of the sprints. Let's say his body center of mass or center of gravity, in this case, is around the belly button. If you draw a vertical line and you keep this, or you take the relation to the foot placement here, the tip of his foot, by touching down, you see that this is a very small distance in comparison to the picture we've seen here when Duty Chand is touching the ground. So we see some technical opportunities here. Yeah, and this is the same picture of a biomechanical analysis. You see this red small dot here is the body center of mass. Then the yellow line is the vertical projection. Here's this red ball is the foot placement on the ground. And this horizontal distance, this is the so-called touchdown distance. And this touchdown distance has to be as small as possible to reduce the braking impulse. So faster sprinters show a reduced touchdown distance. And how do they reach that shorter touchdown distance? It's very simple, by executing a proper ground preparation phase. And that means faster sprinters showing a faster hip extension. Yeah, the way they're extending their hip, the way they're hammering down the leg. And coaching cues here are grab back or pull back the track. And we need to get our hip as quick as possible over the foot placement. And this so-called hip extension velocity, the ability to extend your hip very powerfully and as fast as possible, highly correlates with the running velocity. So whatever exercise or drill you are executing with your athletes, always ensure that there's a very quick hip extension. And that means we have to shift away from this idea to raise our knees, to go for high knee exercises. And we have to do the opposite, because otherwise, if you go for high knees, most likely you are teaching your athletes to increase this touchdown distance. Because if you're focusing on the hip flexion rather than the hip extension, you won't be quick enough to get your feet underneath your glutes or your hip. Here's another example of a 100-meter race during the Southeast Asian Games. Just sorry, the presentation is a bit messed up here. But you see, the girl in the front, Malaysian sprinter, has again a very small touchdown distance. Her foot is not only on the ground, but the girl, which is ranked 8th here, shows a very large touchdown distance. So this is one of the critical factors. Get your feet underneath your hip, yeah, and do it as quick as possible. So we talked about this hip extension velocity, and another advantage of a very powerful hip extension is a greater step length. Because if you are applying, or if you're extending your hip in a faster way, you're also able to increase the so-called vertical ground reaction forces. And these vertical ground reaction forces are also related to your running speed. Faster sprinters, again, show higher vertical ground reaction forces, and they result overall in a greater step length. And sprinters produce the highest force at time of the maximum hip extension velocity. So a high hip extension velocity and an active downward backward movement of the thighs have a positive impact on running velocity. Yeah, we can positively impact the frequency, but if we are extending our hips extremely fast, we might even have a positive impact on the step length at the same time. So always focus on the hip extension of your athletes and tell them to hammer their legs down. And here's just one quick example how to do that. You can see an increasing distance in between the cones. So this is real speed. Now we see the slow motion. Yeah, you can see the left leg is straight, right leg is actively hammering down. The focus on a very, very quick hip extension. And again, that's a super slow motion. Tomorrow, we will see many more drills and exercises to show you how to teach the hip extension. Another video of a sprint start. This is a German sprinter, 11:02 on 100 meters. Yeah, and you can also see a very powerful extension of the glutes, fully extended hip here, already from the first steps onwards. And two other critical factors, which we will discuss later, are the dorsiflexion and a slightly bended knee during the takeoff. Yeah, you can see it's a huge dorsiflexion. That means the toes are looking up from the very first moment. And additionally, while she's extending her hip, she's not fully extending her knee. Yeah, just observe, the knee remains in a slightly bended position. So good sprinters, how we say, are always running away from the knee. They're only extending the hip, but we try to avoid a full knee extension. So by reducing the touchdown distance and by focusing on the hip extension, we're also able to increase the stiffness of our knee. And stiffness does not mean that your athletes are getting inflexible. The mobility always has to be very high. But reduced braking impulses can cause less amortization of the knee joint. And amortization just means how much is your athlete bending his or her knee during the ground contact. And we know, again, from sports science, that knee stiffness or stability at the knee joint is increasing with running velocity. That means faster sprinters show greater knee angles at the instance of touchdown and less amortization. So if a top athlete is touching the ground after the ground preparation phase, at the beginning of the ground contact phase, they have a wider knee angle. So instead of probably 150 degrees, some of the top sprinters show 165-degree angles. At the same time, they show less amortization. That means from the instance of touchdown towards the mid-stance, they're only bending the knee, maybe by 6 or 7 degrees. Where the less experienced sprinters bend their knee often by 10 or 15 degrees, which results, of course, in much lower knee angles and a higher so-called oscillation. Oscillation means the vertical movement of the body center of mass. And please remember, faster sprinters show less amortization and less oscillation. So how do we do that? Another example. Yeah, here on the left hand, you can see the sprinter you've formerly seen in the video. She's doing 11:0 seconds. On the right hand, you see an 11.4 female sprinter. And interestingly, the foot trajectories, so how the feet are crossing these force plates here, looks a bit different. You can see that this athlete, the fast one, has a so-called negative acceleration of their feet. So before hitting the ground, her feet are moving backwards. And the reason we call it negative acceleration is because the foot is actually moving away from the finish line. So every movement towards the finish line is called a positive movement. Every movement away is called a negative movement. And faster sprinters always show an increased negative acceleration of the feet. Yeah, so there's less braking. Here, the slower athlete, you can see, is only positive movement, and the foot in a certain way is shopping the ground. Yeah, this athlete is causing a lot of braking. That means she's reducing her velocity and she limits the quality of her acceleration during ground contact. So if you do a video analysis of your athletes, always ensure the feet are moving backwards. Yeah, let's have a look on this video again. Yeah, if you see the left foot here, now it's moving backwards already. So even before the foot is touching the ground, it's accelerated backwards, away from the finish line. And thereby we reduce the braking and we increase the acceleration of our athletes. So the question now is, do we have an active or a passive foot plant? And as you've probably seen in the video, we definitely have to stay in a so-called dorsiflex position. That means the toes up. And even here we have a scientific explanation because the plantar flexion moment is higher in the eccentric phase. That means during the first part in comparison to the concentric phase. And that actually indicates that this plantar flexion moment is based on internal reflexes rather than a deliberately controlled action. Yeah, so we have to keep our toes dorsiflexed, and actually the stretch shortening cycle will ensure that we have a proper and quick ground contact. Yeah, and the stretch shortening cycle here, as I see at the ankle joint, supports the hip flexion and a quick recovery of the thigh during the swing phase. So if we keep our feet in a dorsiflex position, we will have more force application because there's a higher stability of the ankle joint and we can probably use the stretch shortening cycle. At the same time, it will reduce the ground contact times and it will even help us with a better recovery phase of the same leg. Yeah, so please tell your athletes to maintain in a dorsiflex position with the toes looking up. And this is one of the main cues we have to consider for all technical drills we're doing. But again, tomorrow you will get some examples presented by Coach Mohan and Nagesh. Yeah, 2 examples even for drop jumps where we have to keep the toes in a dorsiflex position. And in slow motion, you see the athlete is always trying to maintain in a position where the toes are looking up. There's no active foot plant. And this is a very young athlete. It was a 14-year-old girl. Here we have a slightly older athlete, which has more stability, and therefore we use a slightly higher box. Yeah, still it's not perfect. As you can see, there's a bit of amortization at the knee joint, which we actually want to avoid, but it's quite good. So by performing drop jumps, you always have to ensure that your toes are dorsiflexed and that your knee remains in a straight position because we want to avoid this banding, the amortization. So stay tall, keep your toes up. Yeah, and the same principles occur during a sprint movement. And here's the quality of the video is actually a bit poor, but you see a really nice technique, and just check the dorsiflexion and the hip extension of this athlete and the stability of her knee joint. You can see there's almost zero amortization, no bending of the knee, and a very dorsiflexed position of the feet immediately after feet are leaving the ground. She's a 200-meter runner, I think is 22.7 personal best, a semi-finalist at the recent World Championships in Doha. And this dorsiflex position, that's what the American coaches call the credit card rule. Yeah, we want to have this dorsiflexion, the toes looking up, and the heel stays very close to the ground. They call it credit card rule because only credit card should fit in between the ground and the heel. But we of course have to avoid a ground contact of the heel because that would reduce the quality of our stretch shortening cycle. So we have vertical alignment, powerful hip extension, dorsiflexion, very little amortization. The arms are hammering backwards. Yeah, that's a really nice running technique. So we also mentioned as a last point about a proper application or proper technique during the recovery phase. Yeah, and we know that sprinters nowadays, they try to avoid the so-called backside mechanics. And that's another exercise we don't want to see any longer on the track. These are the butt kicks. Yeah, we can still see that a lot of athletes are performing butt kicks as a technique drill or during warm-up. But actually during the recovery phase, we want the hamstring muscles to be completely relaxed. And that means there should be zero activation of the hamstrings. So all the action during the recovery phase should be taken mainly by the hip flexors and, as I've mentioned earlier, because of the reactive capacity of the calf muscles. But during the recovery phase, once the foot is leaving the ground, we want to have a fully relaxed hamstring muscle, because otherwise we might have a lack of coordination between the hamstring or the hip flexors and the hip extensors, and that could cause injuries. So faster sprinters initiate the recovery phase earlier. And here you can see a perfect example of a Safa Powell. His leg is not fully extended. He's fully extending his hip, but the knee joint remains slightly bended, because a full hip extension would just cause a vertical lift. And that's something we want to avoid. Yeah, so fully extend your hip at the late stance phase, but ensure that your knee remains in a slightly bended position. And by doing so, we can also reduce the inner thigh angle. And inner thigh angle just means that when the left foot is hitting the ground, that the right leg is almost at a similar position. Yeah, I will show you this video again. Here we have a perfect example. The right foot is hitting the ground, and you can see that the left knee is already in front or ahead of the knee of the stance leg. Yeah, with slower sprinters, we will have a wider inner thigh angle. That means the thigh would probably be directed in such a position with the shank like this. But fast sprinters or top sprinters, once the support leg is touching the ground, the free leg, the swing leg knee has already crossed the knee of the supporting leg. Yeah, so as coaches, if you do a video analysis, it's very easy to identify whether your athlete has a small or wide inner thigh angle, the angle in between the thigh, and you have to keep it as small as possible, maybe even negative. Yeah, and avoiding a full knee extension and focusing on the hip action definitely helps you to reduce this angle. So they avoid a full extension of the knee joint during the late stance phase, and instead the focus should be on a quick recovery, utilizing the stretch shortening cycle of the calf as well as of the hip flexors here. Yeah, so focus again on the hip extension, but avoid a knee extension. And overall, remember this: we need to combine strength with coordination and technique, and that will equal speed or power. Yeah, remember the horizontal velocity, as mentioned in the beginning, is just about increasing your horizontal impulse, and impulse means force over time divided by body mass. So try to keep the body mass of your athlete low or even stable, at least stable if you start introducing speed training, and increase your strength, improve your technique, and your athlete will definitely become faster. And since in all speed-related events, since the central nervous system becomes one of the limiting factors, we need to ensure that we follow a quality approach rather than a quantity approach, because we need to work at intensities higher than 98 or 99% of your maximum velocity. Otherwise, we will not be able to affect the central nervous system in the right way. If you do speed training, stay below 6 or 7 seconds, because otherwise you're affecting speed endurance, lactic acid, and that will directly cause deceleration. Especially with kids below the age of 17 or 18, we should not do any lactic acid training at all, because they need much more recovery time. A quality over quantity, and keep in mind that less sometimes is more, especially when it comes to loads on the central nervous system, like speed training, strength training, or coordination training. Yeah, thank you very much. I think we open
Before starting to the question and answer session, I like to welcome Mr. P.K. Srivastava, the Secretary of, the Treasurer of AFI to the Zoom session. Thank you for your presence, sir.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe.
You can start with the question and answer session, Mr. Okay. Rajmohan.
Maybe here I see one question. In endurance athletes, speed also plays an important role. Of course, the principles I just introduced are exactly the same for middle and long distance runners as well. And the endurance coaches amongst you, they might be aware that especially this speed reserve becomes, from a physiological perspective, becomes more and more important. So if you're dealing with 800 meter, 1500 meter or long distance runners, ensure that you're conducting a lot of speed training as well. Because this speed reserve, that means the average velocity in, for example, your 800 meter race, in comparison to the maximum velocity, will make it much easier for your athlete to handle the physiological aspects. Yeah, so at least once a week, the endurance coaches should conduct a speed session as well, maybe for the younger athletes even more often.
There is a question from one of the coach. The question is how to improve faster hip extension.
Yeah, we will have a whole session on drills for hip extension tomorrow. But again, in general, it's just you have to find opportunities for your athletes to hammer down their legs. Yeah, that the thigh becomes a hammer, the shank is a nail, and you really have to push downwards very, very hard. And in general, try to avoid, again, these high knee exercises, because that's where we're doing exactly the opposite, where we're trying to raise our knee rather than extending our hip. And you cannot apply force by raising your knee, at least not a lot. Yeah, so we need to rethink this idea of sprint drills. We have to focus on the hip extension. Otherwise, you're disabling your athletes from running faster. Sorry, I can't hear you.
What are the advantages and disadvantages of blade runner?
Blade runners? Ah, okay, yeah. The question is whether there were advantages or disadvantages for disabled runners who were wearing blades or prostheses. They have actually a few advantages, of course, a lot of disadvantages in life as well. But from a biomechanical perspective, these athletes have an advantage since the mass, especially of the shank or the leg, is much lower in comparison to athletes who have the gastrocnemius muscle or the bones, the foot. So the mass of the limb is a bit reduced, and of course that reduces the lever arm, and they are able to flex or extend the hip even in a quicker way. In addition, whenever you are touching down, and that's why it's so important to reduce this touchdown distance to avoid this breaking. These athletes who are running with a blade, they show actually almost zero amortization. So the amount of energy they are wasting during the ground contact is much lesser in comparison to the abled athlete. And that's one of the reasons why Oscar Pistorius, for example, you know, this 400-meter sprinter from South Africa, was also a decent shooter, was for some time not allowed to participate in the Olympics. And even the the governing body for the disabled sports, they have a lot of rules now. So not every blade is allowed. There are certain technical restrictions to it.
Thank you, sir. Are you able to hear me, sir?
Yes, loud and clearly now.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Sir, another question is, what about, can you explain the amortization phase and the exercises to reduce the amortization phase?
Yeah, the amortization phase is actually very easy for you to observe as a coach. If you are watching the so-called sagittal plane, that means you're observing the athlete from a lateral view from the side. Whenever your athlete is touching the ground, whether it's in a sprint, a run, even in the jumps, they are always slightly bending their knee joint. And this bending of the knee joints, the hip joint, even the ankle joint is called amortization. Because whilst touching down, they are lowering the hip or the body center of mass. And this lowering of the body center of mass, that's something we have to avoid, because faster sprinters or faster runners show lesser amortization. If you see Eliud Kipchoge's world record race in the marathon, for example, and if you compare it to a 2:20 marathon runner on the last 2 kilometers, you will see significant differences. Kipchoge is able to maintain a very tall hip position, and when he's touching down, he has a very small touchdown distance, and the knee joint, the hip joint, ankle joint remains almost straight. Yeah, so there's very little bending. So the question, how do you affect this in training? Personally, I would do a lot of jumps, maybe with a focus on isometric landing, especially in the beginning of the season. You can use eccentric strength training for the senior athletes above the age of 19, 20. And in addition, of course, you have to conduct or use the right drills. And again, these drills will be what we're going to show you tomorrow.
Thank you, sir. Sir, next question is, how can we break performance plateau? If an athlete is not improving his speed or her speed, what is to be done to improve his speed?
Yeah, there's still a discussion going on whether there's actually such a performance plateau. There are usually two reasons for these plateaus. And the first one is simply that the athlete is coming closer to his peak age. And again, as older the athlete gets, as smaller is the improvement from one season to the other. And the other reason for performance plateau might actually be low quality training. Yeah. So if you realize that your athlete is not improving any longer, I think the most important point is that you reconsider your training, that you have a close look into your training. Did you use the right training methods? Did you properly use training methods which were causing an early specialization? Did you use training methods which were not age-related? Yeah, for example, we should not do resistance training before the age of 18. And we know that in India, even 13, 14-year-old kids are already pulling sleds or tires or whatever. So this is definitely causing a situation where we have this early specialization. And of course, early specialization always goes along with this plateau. And to break this plateau is not that easy. Sometimes it takes several years to overcome that, if at all. Certain athletes, and that's due to genetical factors, might even be destroyed in a certain way regarding their performance for life. Because if you see, or if you understand a bit about the way muscle cells or neurons are adapting to certain loads, some of them are acting like switches. It's only either on or off. And the problem is, if we are using the wrong training methods, we are switching some of them off, and there's no way to switch them on again afterwards. It's the same with muscle fibers. Yeah, faster athletes usually have a higher amount of fast twitch muscle fibers. The problem is, if you're conducting a lot of resistance training, speed endurance training, or too much endurance training in general with young kids, the fast twitch fibers, they will shift to become slow twitch fibers. It's just a bit unfortunate because the slow twitch fibers cannot become fast twitch fibers. So this is an irreversible process. And it's nice to see that Mr. Kamimutu has a very ordered desktop. But maybe you stop sharing this. Yeah, so we have to be careful. Always use the right methods for each age group. Avoid resistance training before the age of 18. No overspeed work at all before the age of 20, 21. And develop the pure speed and basic core strengths, basic endurance before that. Because otherwise we're always in a danger that we have a shift from fast twitch fibers to slow twitch fibers. And that's an irreversible process. So yeah, it's very hard to, maybe impossible to overcome these plateaus. And again, most of these plateaus are due to early specialization.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir. So next question is, how to increase the stride frequency? Is it possible to increase the stride frequency in the later age of an athlete?
Yes, definitely. Of course, the trainability throughout an athlete's career is a bit reduced. The plasticity of the brain is decreased when the athlete gets older, but still we can influence it. Maybe not to such an extent, but we definitely have to focus on it. And there are two factors to frequency. Or actually, there are more factors to frequency. First is, of course, the neuronal patterns in your brain, the central nervous system. And we should establish a very high frequent pattern at early ages. Remember these windows of opportunity, the golden ages of motor learning we've discussed, yeah, from the age of 17 to 14 when it comes to speed. So everything here should be based on frequency. But even at a later stage, you can conduct such drills, frequency drills. In addition, frequency is also a bit depending on your technique. Yeah, when you have a dorsiflexion, shorter ground contact times, this will help you with an increased frequency. In the acceleration phase, for example, you have to keep your feet close to the ground to avoid flight times. Yeah, because during the flight time, you're not able to apply force. That means it slows you down rather than accelerates you. So that's another chance. Yeah, improve your technique to increase the frequency. And even if you have a higher level of strength or power to increase your hip extension and your hip flexion velocity, this will also help you with improving your running frequency.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir. So next question is, while running, as you explained about forward knee angle, what should be the ideal knee angle for rear leg?
Yeah, it's impossible to describe optimal knee angle because it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on your strength level. It depends on your running speed, of course, on your ground contact times. But it also depends on your physics. Yeah, what is your body height? How long is your leg length? Again, what we can say is that you should always fully extend your hip, but keep your knee slightly bended. And then once your foot is leaving the ground, ensure that your knee is immediately moving forward. A lot of athletes, they show a massive butt kick action. And this butt kicking usually comes along with a short delay of the hip flexion. Yeah, so this is something we have to avoid. Also in the warm-up, avoid these butt kicks. Instead, what we're trying to do nowadays is so-called heel flicks. And if you do the heel flicks, you can ensure that immediately after the ground contact, when the recovery phase starts, that your knee is accelerated forward. And there's one other reason not to do these high knees any longer. If you see the angle of the thigh in comparison to a vertical line, so how high are top athletes raising their knees, you can see that most of the athletes nowadays, they only reach angles of around 65, a maximum of 70 degrees. So it's far away from a 90-degree angle. And again, the reason for this is that we focus much more on hip extension. And if you raise your knee to a 90-degree angle, hamstrings are not able to contribute to the hip extension in an efficient way. Because the smaller the hip angle gets, and let's say at a 90-degree angle of the thigh, it's mainly the glutes which are working, but the hamstrings are not activated. If you have a 65 or 70-degree angle of the thigh, yeah, that means not parallel to the ground, but properly like this. This would be a 90-degree angle. This is a 65, 70-degree angle. At these angles, the glutes and the hamstrings at the same time are contributing to the hip extension. That means we can generate more power during a forceful ground preparation phase.
Thank you, sir. So next question, what are the different cues we could use during the acceleration phase if some athlete is unable to strike the feet behind or underneath the hips?
Yeah, I think that's something we are going to discuss tomorrow, but in general, in acceleration, that means mainly the first 15 meters, the focus should be on a powerful push from the hip. Yeah, you need to tell your athletes to run away from the knee. Of course, the toes up, and it might make sense to use markers on the ground so that you tell your athletes they have to hit these markers by pulling their feet back and pushing from the hip.
Thank you, sir. So the Indian sprinters are much slower in the first 60 meters, as we discussed earlier. In the last part, is it a technical problem or because of lack of power or something else? What is your opinion, sir?
Yeah, I have a very clear opinion on this, and I think a lot of coaches nowadays are sharing this opinion. Personally, I feel that in India, we are facing a lack of speed training. So some coaches, they believe they're conducting speed training, but what they actually do conducting is speed endurance training. Again, if you're covering, especially with female athletes, if you're covering distances longer than 60 meters, you force them to decelerate. And we know a lot of typical training programs that coaches are doing 80 meters, 100, 120, 80. And they think they're improving speed. But actually, that's not what's happening. You're improving speed endurance. The problem is if you're improving speed endurance without developing the speed first, you're mainly increasing your endurance. And that was the interesting observation we understood from the evaluation of these results last year. Yeah? Because our athletes, I can guarantee you, all these athletes who came to the national camp, they were mostly conducting speed endurance or special endurance sessions. Still, they were lacking in this ability to maintain the maximum velocity. And the reasons for that are quite obvious. First, a lack of speed. They're simply not fast enough. So that means they're also not able to maintain a proper speed. And secondly, despite this massive amount of speed or special endurance training, including a lot of lactic acid, yeah, they were not able to maintain even the lower speed they reached. And the reason for that is that they were neglecting the aerobic capacity. And nowadays, most of the sprinters, instead of doing this speed endurance training, they're conducting more so-called extensive intervals, where they focus on building a strong aerobic base, because this will also help you to make your energy production a bit more efficient and to sustain or maintain your velocity. So proper sprint training should mainly consist of speed development and endurance development, not by doing long runs or so, but by doing maybe certain forms of circuit training and conducting these extensive intervals. And actually the lactic acid training has to be reduced. There are coaches who are not doing more than 4 or 5 speed endurance sessions with 100-meter sprinters before the competition phase, because the body does not need that many sessions. It's a bit different if you're a 200 or 400-meter sprinter. Yeah, but even for them, the amount of aerobic capacity becomes much more important these days. And obviously for our Indian athletes, you know, who are conducting sometimes 3, 4 speed endurance sessions a week, they're still showing these weaknesses. So we really have to reconsider this training structure. Focus more on strength, speed, and general endurance, and avoid doing a lot of speed endurance because it does not help you. And never apply speed endurance before the pre-competition phase, because you need to develop the maximum velocity first to maintain this maximum velocity with your speed endurance sessions. If you start speed endurance sessions at the beginning of the season, it makes no sense. Yeah, because you're only maintaining a sub-maximum velocity, and that doesn't help anyone.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. So another question is vertical or horizontal exercises, which is more suitable to reduce ground contact time?
In the beginning, I would definitely focus on the horizontal aspect, this negative acceleration of the feet. You have to get your feet underneath your hip. With experienced athletes, Yeah, once you reached a very high frequency, that's when you have to start focusing a bit more on the vertical aspects as well. But the vertical aspects are more related to conditioning, yeah, to increase muscle strength, to increase the muscle stiffness. So try to work on the horizontal aspects, this negative acceleration, to reduce the touchdown distance first. And once this is done properly, maybe by the age of 18, 19, you can slowly introduce the vertical aspects as well.
Thank you, sir. An athlete can maintain a peak performance, that means maximum speed, for how many days?
Usually we say around 5, maybe 4 to 8 days. Yeah, so you have to conduct a speed session around every 4 to 8 days. We're also saying that we have to conduct speed training throughout the year, but speed training does not necessarily mean that you have to run with maximum velocity. Yeah, we have to do a lot of acceleration in the beginning. You can even use drills, frequency drills for speed training. If you combine, for example, in the general preparation, when you're conducting maximum strength training, you don't necessarily want to have a maximum running velocity, because if you combine maximum running velocity with maximum strength, there's a very high chance of injuries. But if you do a bit of acceleration, for example, before or after your strength session, or if you combine your maximum strength session with frequency drills or technique drills, you will also affect your speed in a very positive way. So we have to conduct speed sessions throughout the year, but the speed sessions does not necessarily mean that you're running at maximum velocity. Yeah, do a lot of drills where you focus on the hip extension, maybe hip flexion, and some acceleration work, and that should be sufficient, especially in the first part of the season, the general preparation.
Thank you, sir. What is more important in long distance running, its frequency or the stride length?
Yeah, if you follow the presentation carefully, you realize that frequency and stride length are actually depending on the same ability, and that means extending your hip. We can see nowadays that, I mentioned Kipchoge during his marathon world record, that even the top middle distance runners, they have a higher frequency. In the middle and long distance, we call it cadence. Yeah, so these top athletes show a higher running cadence, but it's again depending on the same aspects. Yeah, they have a smaller touchdown distance, they have lesser amortization, and they're slightly more powerful when it comes to the hip extension. Even marathon runners, especially middle distance runners, they're doing a lot of strength training for their hip extensors these days for exactly these reasons.
Thank you, sir. Is upright body running is better or forward lean running is better for speed?
In the acceleration, you definitely need this forward lean, but it has to come with a fully extended hip joint. Yeah, that's a mistake a lot of coaches are doing. If you tell your young kids, your young athletes to have a forward lean, what they're doing, don't have an extended position, they slightly bend their hip. So the upper body is leaning forward, yeah, and the legs are still in an upright position. And remember, one of the key technical aspects that we always have a fully extended hip, that we have a vertical alignment. Yeah, so in the acceleration, we have a forward lean, of course, but the hip is still fully extended. It does not look like it's always fully extended. And at maximum velocity, of course, we have this upright position, usually around a 2 to 3 degree forward lean, but that's it. Yeah, just ensure that you stay tall, that you have a fully extended hip position, that the head is an elongation of the upper body. And again, that during the ground preparation, ground contact phase, that you're fully extending your hip joint. And if you see that your athlete is not able to extend the hip during acceleration phase, for example, it might, or in most cases, it's actually a lack of strength. That either the back extensors or the hip extensors are not yet strong enough to maintain a proper technical model.
Thank you, sir. Sir, one more question is there. For beginners, how to identify or what are the parameters to check which event is suitable for? Example, for sprinters, jumpers, and what will be the ideal age and what will be the ideal parameters? This is from out of syllabus, sir. If you can explain, please.
Yeah, it's a very good question. in the earlier presentation, we shared already that talent identification in athletics before the age of 16 or 17 is almost impossible. And we also shared that before the age of 16, 17, you should not even start the specialization. So what we have to do, and that's what most of the successful countries in track and field are doing, that until the age of 15, 16, we should still cover a lot of different events. Yeah, you should be sprinting, jumping, also doing some throwing, shot put, javelin, whatever. Yeah, to just increase your base, your fundamental base of motor skills. Interestingly, the talent identification for most of the athletics events, except the middle long distance, is more or less the same. Because we need to ensure that the talents have a lot of fast twitch muscle fibers. In the end, what I mentioned, speed becomes the limiting factor. It's for a sprinter, of course, they need to be very fast, but also a shot putter has to be extremely fast, because most or the highest performance limiting factor is the release speed of the shot. The performance limiting factor in the long jump is the resultant velocity during or after the takeoff. Yeah, so it always goes back to speed. And speed in an athletics context means how fast are you able to generate and to apply your muscle strength. So the ability for sprinters, jumpers, throwers eventually is the same. And the best way to identify this ability is, for example, if you have a force plate or a contact mat and you just perform, or you ask your athletes to perform a drop jump, maybe from a 20 or 30 centimeter box. And you see how high are they able to jump and how long is the ground contact. And you can take the relationship between height and ground contact. And this is a so-called drop jump index. And athletes with a higher drop jump index usually show a higher amount of fast twitch fibers. That means they're more talented. You've had even, maybe you remember David Stoll, the German shot putter. He became world champion in, I'm not sure, 2011, I think. He was able to run 30-meter flying in 2.89 seconds. 2.89 is approximately, if you extrapolate it, it's around 10.6, 10.7 on 100 meters. Yeah, so this world champion shot put would be among the fastest athletes in India in the 100 meters. Yeah, and I just want to use this as an example that the ability to generate force or power within a short amount of time becomes the limiting factor. And that's the only way to identify the talent of an athlete. And it's the same for, again, throws, jumps, and sprints. Another way is just to measure, for example, it's a bit easier, not that predictive, but you can also measure the 20-meter acceleration time. And if you do this with 12, 13-year-old kids, you identify the talents, but again, use these talents, expose them to different training methods and to different events as well. And then at the age of 15, 16, you decide in which direction or which event the athlete is actually going to specialize. But everything before that will not be helpful. Yeah, and remember, there was one slide today saying that the most talented athletes are those who are able to perform with a low amount of specialized training at the age of 16, 17, 18. Because only afterwards, that's where we really start a very intensified approach. Again, in athletics, we have to compete with the other sports. So probably your bosses will complain if you're only training 4 or 5 times. So use maybe the second session of a day just to do some coordination, some flexibility, some relaxation, whatever. But don't train too much. Less is more, especially with our junior athletes. Otherwise, we're going to destroy them and we're disabling them from becoming successful.
Thank you, Walter. It was a very detailed and explained session on speed training. Thank you all for participating. Once again, I remind you, it was a repeated request. Don't scribble with your screen when presentation is on, because it makes a lot of marks on the presentation. Once again, I am requesting, and I request Mr. Negi, Dr. Negi, I'm going to make you host, and all the side coaches has to be present after the session. Walker, you want to add something?
No, yeah, thank you very much for joining today's session. I know it was a bit more technical, but I think that's the way to go for all of us, yeah? And I hope that you found it somehow fruitful. Let's keep the discussion going on. And if you have any related sessions, yeah, and please don't ask for a training program for your grandmother. But if you have any questions regarding today's session and the last sessions, the sessions to come, you can actually write us an email to education@indianathletics.in. Yeah, education@indianathletics.in, and we will pick these questions up during one of the next sessions. Thank you very much. Have a good day. And tomorrow we're going to intensify today's session by presenting a lot of drills for you, yeah, so that you get an idea of how to apply the principles we've introduced today. Goodbye.
So we will be joining tomorrow at the same time with the same Zoom ID. Thank you for participation. And Dr. Nagy, I'm going to transfer this session to you as a host.